um, through HMD in the town. So looking forward to that. The other thing that I would mention is, and I can mention this at the end again, but you guys might remember, every year, for those of you who haven't met me, I think everybody here has, but on an annual basis, we do a historic home tour here in the Ag Reserve. Typically, we do that in May. This year, just a result of like a lot of our historic homeowners just happen to be doing a bunch of different renovation projects through the spring. So we decided to move that tour. So that tour is going to be September 12th, from 9:30 in the morning to 3 p.m. I will be sending out a lot more, and I recognize that's well in advance, but just kind of a save the date notice now, and I will make sure that the seniors have it on their calendar for everybody to get tickets who's interested in doing that, because that's always a really fun event. Um, okay, let me share my screen here, and hopefully you guys will be able to see it. Okay, so it is the 250th anniversary of the nation. It's also 250th anniversary of Montgomery County, which is interesting. Kind of a fun fact is that Montgomery County was named for Richard Montgomery, who fought in the Revolutionary War, and was killed in Quebec. It was named for him, even though he actually had never even stepped foot in the territory that we now know as Montgomery County, which is kind of like a fun bar trivia fact that the county is named for somebody who never actually was here. Um, but even the act of naming the county for a veteran who had been killed in battle fighting against the British was a bit of an act of defiance in the first place, right? So Montgomery County really from the start, um, in just that simple naming action, it kind of put its flag in the ground as to where it stood. Both with at, essentially, if you go back in history, what we had was Frederick County was essentially this massive county that stretched all the way from the borders of DC up into the western portion of Maryland. And around the Revolutionary War time, or shortly after, it was split into three initially. So it became Frederick County also kind of was carved out to create Montgomery County as well as Washington County. And so, in that act, we have these two new counties to the state after the war, named for obviously George Washington and Richard Montgomery, both veterans of the Revolutionary War. And it was kind of just, it was an act of showing kind of where we stood as a nation, not naming the county for, you know, um, something British related or for the king or the queen or anything like that. Where if you actually look across the country and you look at the names of a lot of different counties across the country, you will see that they tie back to British dynasty, right? So kind of an interesting start from the beginning. Um, so, I was thinking about that and thinking it probably makes sense to talk about the ag reserves connections to the Revolutionary War. And I'll be honest, I think, as we go through these, I think really what I'm kind of interested in is the connection to the war for sure, but more just our connection to Great Britain prior to the war, kind of the influence that Great Britain had on Maryland as a colony and this portion of Maryland's colony here in the Ag Reserve. And then really kind of post-war, the veterans who returned home in a very similar way when we've talked about the Civil War before, where it's, you have all these at that time just sons going off to fight in war, and then the war ends and you have this moment where they return home to these farms here in the ag reserve and kind of just get to work doing whatever it is that is next, right? And so a lot of the ag reserve that we know today was shaped in those early years after the Revolutionary War as, as a new nation, by these individuals who had fought in battles against the British. And so I kind of wanted to kind of just talk through some of those connections. And I think, a bunch of the houses that I'm going to use as kind of the prism through which to do that, we've talked about before, but we can kind of talk about how they maybe tie into the war and to the British influence. I've done this presentation once before, and so I always joke kind of like, here's the intro slide and the conclusion. What role did the Ag Reserve play in the Revolutionary War? And you can see not much, and I kind of joke like, so that's my talk. Um, so it's different than the Civil War. In the Civil War, we have, significant amounts of troop movements through the area. We have little skirmishes here and there in literally inside the town of Poolesville. We have encampments of Union troops. We have many sons leaving to fight for the Confederacy, right? There very, very strong connections and ties to what was taking place in the Civil War. The Revolutionary War was a little different. I think the connections are not quite as tight in that way to the actual war. But again, I think that this area was certainly influenced by the events that took place before, during, and after this conflict. And so what I thought I would do is just kind of talk through some of these different homes in the area or different locations, and just provide some sense of what do those connections look like. And at the end, as always, if there are questions, I'm more than happy to talk through this. I would tell you personally, I think I am more familiar with the Civil War and its history in this area, just because there's a lot more literature on it. There's a lot more documentation, even though the 1860s were a long time ago. The 1770s, 1780s were much longer ago. And the amount of accounting at that time was far more limited than we had during the Civil War, right? And so I think part of the challenge in talking about the Revolutionary War at a very local level is that the accounting of it is not great. It's very hard to kind of find, different stories and experiences of the people who lived here in the Ag Reserve during that time. So I'm going to do my best to kind of talk through that using these structures as a way to kind of to do it. So first, Monocacy Cemetery. I don't know. This is something that I've, said multiple times, and I don't know how many of you on here have been out to Monocacy Cemetery before. If you have not been out there, it's out in Bellsville. I really, really encourage you to do so for a few reasons. First is it has just incredible history. And you can see earliest burials dating back to the 1750s, well before the country was a country, when Maryland was a colony, right? And so I think that's like one interesting thing. When you walk through the Monocacy Cemetery, you truly do get to kind of get a glimpse at the different family names that have been here since the late 1700s, early 1800s. Um, it's also the resting place for veterans of, I believe, literally every single American conflict from the Revolutionary War onward. And Glenn Wallace, who I know has been on here talking, who kind of is the chair of the board out there at Monocacy Cemetery, kind of keeps things running out there, has done a really, really good job at ensuring that veterans at Monocacy Cemetery are appropriately cataloged and marked. And so it's a cemetery where not only is it historic, but there's been a lot of work done to ensure that visitors can kind of understand what it is that they're looking at. And within Monocacy, just tying it to the Revolutionary War, we have a number of Revolutionary War veterans from the Ag Reserve region, from this like western portion of the Ag Reserve, who are buried out there. Here's 8 of them. I believe this is probably most. There is, if you go to the cemetery, there is kind of an old chapel kind of at the top of the cemetery. And right next to the chapel, what they refer to as kind of the old burial grounds, is where you will find most of these Revolutionary War veterans with their families buried. And so these are, some of the older burials in the cemetery. But I just think it's pretty remarkable that here in this relatively local rural area, we have these veterans of our earliest conflict, at least as a nation, marked and cataloged. And so, again, I would just encourage that, especially in this 250th anniversary, it's a really cool place to visit. It's much larger than I think most people expect if they haven't been out there before. And it's a really good way to kind of explore some of the local history of our area. Okay, so to the homes. So Chiswell's Inheritance. I've talked about this home many, many times. I'm sure you're all probably tired of hearing about it. For those who have not heard about it, it's a historic home. You can see completed in 1796, although we believe, was kind of built over a period of years leading up to 1796. Completely possible that it actually started in the 1780s, the construction on this home. It built for Stephen Newton Chiswell and his son Joseph. And I think the interesting connection here, the reason I would put it on kind of in the conversation with regards to the Revolutionary War is that Stephen Newton Chiswell emigrated from England over to what we now know as Prince George's County in 1735. So he took a ship over from England, actually was shipwrecked off the coast of Rhode Island, somehow managed to survive that shipwreck. They say that he had like, I think it was like 6 silver spoons in a trunk of like clothing that he managed to bring ashore with him and managed to make his way down to Prince George's County. He was working for his uncle and fell in love with his uncle's eldest daughter. And again, if you're doing the math, that would be his cousin. Um, Back in those days, that was relatively normal. You see things in family trees today that, would be illegal today if you did it, but back in those times, it was relatively normal. So they were engaged and essentially left the area, came out and built a log cabin out at where Kingsbury Orchard is currently located in the 1740s. Lived there for a number of years. Stephen became he. I'm not exactly sure where the wealth came from, but he acquired a lot of property in the area. Now you have to understand that when we think about the Ag Reserve today, and we think about the earliest settlers, um, you know, following Native Americans that were here on this land, our earliest settlers really started to kind of show up in the 1750s, 1760s time frame. Those are like the earliest settlers. So there was truly nothing out here. I don't know how easy it was to get a patent for land at that time from the king, but Stephen Newton Chiswell managed to do that and got a lot of property in this region. And so he came out here, lived in this log house, and then managed to get this property just outside of what we now know as Poolsville. This was really before Poolsville was Poolsville, and he passed the property down to his son Joseph, and I believe that collectively they began to build this home. So this structure was likely built kind of on the tail end of the Revolutionary War. We know that Stephen, coming from England, had a deep appreciation for English architecture. This Chiswell's Inheritance is really the first home in the area where there was a very intentional decision to think about English design and structure and architecture in building the home. Most of the other homes that were built at that time were much more simple and utilitarian in nature. This is the first one that was really designed to withstand the test of time, and it certainly has. I was just out here a few weeks ago, and it looks as amazing as it did the day it was built. Um, and when you look at the interior of this home, there are a lot of ornate details that reflect Stephen's upbringing in England. it's there are records that indicate that actually Stephen built this home to be a fairly similar model to the home that he actually grew up in England. I haven't seen definitive proof of that, but I think it's interesting. So he had this very strong tie. That said, we do also know that he signed the oath of fidelity to the United States, or at that time, which essentially was an oath that residents in the area and across the colonies at that point in time were asked to sign to basically declare their allegiance against the king, which was at the time, I mean, in hindsight, it looks like a smart, obvious thing to do, but at the time, I'm sure that that was, potentially a difficult decision to make. Those who did not sign that oath, in many cases, lost their homes, were run out of towns, so there was a lot of pressure. So despite his interest in kind of English architecture and his upbringing and kind of high design from Great Britain, he made his loyalties clear, at least on paper. And so this is one of those interesting homes that I think just, it kind of ties us back to that time period, right as the nation was forming following the war. As you can see, just a really beautiful home. The bottom center here, you can see it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see 1796 kind of in the glazed brick. So that again, that was when the home was finished. And then above that, the belief is those are letters. It's believed that they are J and E for Joseph and then his wife Eleanor. So that was the son of Stephen, who kind of was the one who largely built this home. Um, there's a lot of different theories about whether or not it truly is a J and an E or if it's something else, but that's been a long running kind of argument. So you can see just really amazing home. A lot of when we talk about history in the Ag Reserve, a lot of it kind of starts here. I think the Chiswells were one of those big, prominent early families, very wealthy, who um, went on to intermarry in a lot of different families. And so as a result, that wealth, that land ownership could largely be tied back to the Chiswell family across the Ag Reserve. Let's see here. Yeah, Jonathan mentions the house at Pleasant Hills has the same architecture. Yeah, that's true. They're again like it's around that very late 1700s time frame when we really start to see some of the wealth get injected into the area with these this kind of like wealthier planter class start to pay attention to actual design and to building structures of permanence and not just for utility. Kind of tied into the Chiswells is yep, the cover, yeah, is the White Carlin Farm. So the White Carlin Farm is actually located out in Boyd's. And you can see it's kind of had a bit of a glow up in the last number of years, and that's because the current owners who have been there for a number of years now, but have done just a really, really great job of restoring the home back to its original prominence. And the White family was another one of those early kind of planter families in the area. They they came into the regions. Sorry, can everybody mute their mics for me, please? They came into the region. They intermarried with the Chiswells to a significant extent. And the reason that, let me see here, the reason I put this home on here is the records indicate it was built around 1800. There are some indications that it was potentially here earlier, potentially built right after the Revolutionary War. I also know, and again, the records are a little bit kind of difficult to pin down here, but William White was a first lieutenant who fought in the Revolutionary War from Virginia. And we believe it's I think it's grandson who built this home. His grandson was Nathan White. And I'm sorry, it was his son, Nathan White. And then it was his son who built Inverness out in Dickerson. And what's interesting to me about that is that the Benjamin White who built Inverness, his grandson was killed in the Civil War, the Battle of Chancellorsville. So I've always found it kind of interesting that this individual, Benjamin White, his grandfather, fought in the Revolutionary War to create the Union, and his grandson fought and died in the Civil War for the Confederacy to split the Union in two. So really interesting kind of just family linkages and heritage and stories being passed down there. And so this home kind of straddles that story. Um, it's again, it's really been preserved quite well by the current owners. You can see in the center picture here, the stairs where they look kind of like rustic. And the reason for that is when I was here taking pictures of it, the owners were methodically stripping back paint layers, trying to get to the original paint colors that they've been trying to match across the house. So they're really, really doing everything they can to try to get the home back to its original condition in any way possible. What you're looking at in the bottom left and in the bottom center is the original summer kitchen. And so, like, as I'm sure most of you know, back in those days when they built these kitchens, they would build them separate from the homes because the concern was if they were attached to the homes and there was a fire, the fire would engulf the entire structure. So they would build the kitchen separate, and that gave some separation. It also ensured that the individuals who were cooking those meals, and it's important to note that at this structure, as well as Chiswell's Inheritance, as well as a lot of the homes I'm going to show you tonight, those people were largely enslaved workers, um, were kind of out of sight. They were in a separate little, property. They weren't in the main home. And so, again, really cool that at this property, that summer kitchen is still very much intact because we've lost a lot of those over the years. They're just small structures. They don't stand up as long in time. This is one of my favorites, Robert Dawson's house. And what's really sad about Robert Dawson's house is that it no longer exists. As you can see in the 1980s, it was in pretty rough shape. Robert Dawson from the Dawson family. So if you've driven through Dawsonville, which is essentially, everybody's been to that kind of fork in the road where 28 hits what I think 107. Um, that is Dawsonville, named again for the Dawson family. Robert Dawson was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. We believe he fought in the Battle of Germantown, where he was injured. Not Germantown, Maryland, a different Germantown. Um, and he returned home from the war, got to work building this structure. He completed the home in 1804. And what's interesting about this is we believe that potentially nobody ever lived in this home. You can see those black and white pictures. Those are from the 1930s. That's from that historic American building survey that the Work Progress Administration ran as part of the New Deal. And you can see there in the 1930s, pretty clearly it's empty, right? Why did this happen? Nobody's completely sure. We know that Robert Dawson, upon returning home from the war, his wife died shortly after. They had already had a number of kids, and he remarried somewhat quickly. And it's thought that he actually was building this home to bring his new wife into it. And there's some speculation, again, this is speculation, who knows, but it's a good story that his children from his first wife were not big fans of his new wife and basically told him, if you're going to move into this home with her, we will not be moving in with you. And so they never moved in and nobody followed after them. And as a result, the home sat empty. And I've always found it interesting, just going back to Monocacy Cemetery, that if you go to Monocacy Cemetery and you go to Robert Dawson's grave, He is buried next to his first wife with the children from his first wife. And his second wife, and the kids, the children that he had with her, is buried in a very different part of the cemetery. So I have no idea. I don't want to read too deeply into that, but I do think it kind of adds something to the story. And so we're not sure if anybody was actually ever in Robert Dawson's house that he spent clearly a lot of time and money following the war building. Um, there at the Sugarland church out there that the Sugarland Ethno History Project runs, there's a picture of this home, and underneath it, there's a caption that says enslaved quarters. And, I've always wondered exactly what that meant, if it's possible that there were enslaved persons in the early 1800s that were living in this structure for some reason. I'm not sure. I suspect at some point somebody did reside here. It's too nice of a home not to. Um, but we have no indications that Robert, after the war and marrying his second wife, ever did. So, an old home that came down in the 1980s. Again, as you look, really bad shape. What is really, I guess, a good news part of this story is that we do know that the stones were reused for a number of different structures in the area. And a couple of years ago, I was talking about this house, and somebody on Facebook sent me a private message. And they had over there, it's just out in the same area where this home is, over their mantle, they have what was clearly like the cornerstone of this house because it has Robert Dawson's initials and the date 1804 in it. So it was exciting to see that while the home was gone, it was reused and kind of lives on in different structures. Hanover is another one of those homes that was built, by a veteran, William Hemstone, immediately following, not immediately following, but following the Revolutionary War. So this was another home completed in the early 1800s. He was another veteran who fought in a number of conflicts throughout the Revolutionary War. He acquired this property and built his home here. And what I think is so, I don't know, ironic is that the home is referred to as Hanover, and that Hanover reference is a reference to the House of Hanover, which is essentially I guess it's like a mark of the dynasty of King George's 1 through 3. So we've got this property kind of named for these kings of England, now lived on by a veteran of the Revolutionary War who built his home there and then named his farm Hanover after it, which I think is, if that was intentional, I very much admire his his thought process there. I think that's pretty funny. Um, as you can see, as you look at the home, kind of on the left-hand side, like we've got the main block of the home, very, very simple in nature, kind of that classic early 1800s federal style with symmetry. In the right picture, there were some additions to the home added in the late 1800s, kind of during the Victorian era, that you can see added on here. Um, yeah, these are largely pictures from a number of years ago. This is, I've talked about this home before, and it's probably time that I kind of raise, public concern about it again. But this is a home that sits on the golf course at Four Seasons. And I don't, I mean, I would be happy to be told otherwise, but I don't believe that the golf club has any plans to do anything with this home. And I have real concerns that this home that was built by a veteran of the Revolutionary War and is on the historic records and on the National Registry will fall down due to neglect over time if something's not done to at least secure the structure. So this is one of those places where I always think kind of a bit more attention on would be helpful. It's also like it's hidden in plain sight. I guarantee all of you, if you've been to Bellsville before, you've passed right by this house. You just didn't realize it, and it's because it's really hidden behind a number of trees and kind of behind this pond. The only real way to see it is to drive onto Four Streams Golf Course. And I think that is private property. I'm not saying I've ever done it, but if you ever wanted to drive there and park, you could see it. It's right there. Solomon Simpson, this is, another interesting historic structure. Um, Solomon Simpson was one of the earlier individuals who acquired a lot of land, seemed to be just very well connected in the region. They call him Colonel Simpson in a lot of the historic records. What is unclear is whether or not he actually fought in the Revolutionary War, and that's where he obtained that rank, or if that was just kind of a title that people gave him. Back in those days, it was fairly common actually for individuals, for men to kind of just be to either claim military ranks or to be in, somewhat informal militias and get a rank. And so you have individuals being referred to as captain or colonel or major, even though they weren't technically part of what we would consider to be the more formal military at that time. So I don't have records of Colonel Simpson actually fighting the Revolutionary War. We just see a lot of indications of people calling him that. He built his plantation in the late 1700s, really one of the earlier residents here, showing up in the 1780s. And you can see as you look at kind of his home, especially on the right, it's this left side portion in stone. That's really the part of the plantation that he built with his enslaved labor force. And then on the right, the green portion of the house was actually built in the 1890s. And so as you look at this greenhouse, like one thing to just kind of observe is that it's very, very tall, right? It's like these three floors plus this attic level up here. Why is that? It based on the going in the basement here, the homeowners believe, and I agree, that essentially in the 1890s, there was a larger portion of Colonel Simpson's initial plantation here. So there was already kind of a foundation that existed. And so when the owners of the property in the 1890s went to build their home on here, they basically, instead of building back and deeper into that, into the property, they just kind of looked at the existing foundation and were just like, all right, instead of building with depth, let's just go up and build on top of this existing foundation. It's a lot cheaper that way and a lot easier. And so that's why we think that the home kind of looks the way that it does. Uh, you can see, I mean, the current homeowners, Tom and Marie, are awesome. They always put this home on the tour every year, and it's a cool ability to see kind of old to older to really really new. So you've got uh, Solomon Simpson's portion of the plantation here, and you can see kind of the pictures on the upper left of what that looks like on the inside. And then you've got that 1890s portion of kind of the main farmhouse. And then they've built this very modern kind of glass kitchen off the back that is, brand new. And so you really have this experience in this home where you can walk into this large fireplace area within Solomon Simpson's, 1780s kitchen into the late 1800s and then into the 2020s in a way that is pretty hard to experience elsewhere. It's a really cool structure in the way that they've brought those old and new pieces together. Annington, this is always one of the homes that comes up here. It's one of those kind of grand homes. It was built in 1813, right? So it's built well after the Revolutionary War ends. We're well into, the nation existing. The reason I put it on here is because it was built by Daniel Trundle. And the Trundle family has a long legacy in this area. We know of many Trundles that fought in the Revolutionary War. We also know the Trundles played a pretty significant role as planters and farmers in the region in helping usher in the transition from tobacco as the main cash crop in the region to wheat and corn, which was happening around the time of the Revolutionary War and then immediately after. Really, it's kind of that turn from the 1700s to the 1800s when we see that transition from like an economic standpoint really taking place, where it's clear that the new cash crop is really wheat. And the Trundles were really early adopters to that, and it brought them a great deal of wealth on top of the wealth that they already had, which enabled them to do things like build grand structures like Annington. And so Daniel Trundle built Annington in 1813. It is this home is much more linked and tied to the Civil War, like likely because it existed during the Civil War and it didn't during the Revolutionary War. Um, so we have a lot of stories of, individuals and Union troops kind of occupying this home during the Civil War. It's believed that Union commanders observed the Battle of Ball's Bluff from the second floor of this structure, which is kind of a cool piece of history. There's a lot of ghost stories that are tied to this structure based on just the history and the figures that have passed through here. And so I think the property maybe has more of a tie to the Revolutionary War in that time frame. I think the home itself is more largely linked to the Civil War, but again, it's that Trundle family linkage that really ties them into the Ag Reserve and the larger Revolutionary War and fight for the nation around the late 1700s. That makes it kind of interesting. You can see in these pictures, um, in the bottom right, 19, I think it's the 1960s, the home went under some significant refurbishment, and then was empty for a while. And that's what you're kind of seeing in the bottom left and upper right, kind of abandoned looking pictures. And then it was owned again for a number of years through the 70s and 80s um, and 90s. And then it's kind of sat vacant for a number of years, but there is again refurbishment taking place on the home right now. And so I'm really, really excited to see what that looks like once completed. I got the opportunity to go in and walk around the home 2 or 3 years ago when it was under um, I wouldn't say it was under construction yet. It was largely vacant, but it was kind of being prepped for construction. And even then, it was the most grand interior of a home I've seen in the Ag Reserve, for sure. And so I'm super excited to see what that looks like once it's kind of brought back to life. Okay, final home, Friends Advice. This one, this is local. So this is a house, again, that most of you have probably driven right past. In fact, Beth, you were mentioning the event at Song Dog earlier. This is just down the street from Song Dog, so it's up kind of Buck Lodge Road, um, and it's built for the Dade family. So Reverend Dade was, I believe, a minister in the mid and late 1700s. Actually, very good friends apparently with George Washington. And following, maybe potentially even right before the war, uh, built Friends Advice. I don't know where that name comes from. That's just, they always have these very interesting property records and survey names. Um, oh, John says John Trumbull was a private in the Revolutionary War. Yeah, cool. And so, actually, that's a good point. So, John mentions that John Trundle was buried in the old Trundle Shreve Cemetery that's now destroyed, which is also true. That cemetery, we believe, or we don't really, we know, was located where the Dickerson power plant is now. And it's unclear exactly where on that property the cemetery was located, but almost for sure kind of bulldozed over just in the construction of the Dickerson power plant. There are a number of homesteads and farms up within that property line. I really want to get out onto that property. I think that there's potentially some interesting things in the woods that are still within the confines of that perimeter. Um, it's just hard to get over there to just explore things. People don't love that reasoning. So I need to find a good reason or a good contact that's working on that site, and it's kind of closed right now, which makes it hard to be able to go explore it. But so Friends Advice, Buck Lodge Road, the Dade's family, or yeah, family friends with George Washington. Dade was a pretty like activist preacher for the Revolution. Built this home in the late 1700s. It was passed down through various lines of the Dade family. It ended up getting to a general, I think it was General Weimacher, who played a significant role in the planning for D-Day during World War II. And after he was I think a 3 or 4 star general. After World War II concluded, he moved with his family here to Friends Advice and lived here through the 70s, 80s, and I think 90s until he passed away. So this home is, kind of cool in that it has linkages both to the Revolutionary War and to World War II, just through its individuals who lived here that were leaders in the cause in both cases. So again, a home with deep roots tied to kind of some of the earliest conflicts. As you can see, I mean, the home has gone through a decent amounts of transformation over the years. There's been a number of additions added to the structure. I think that, as we look at this upper center picture, kind of the far left portion, kind of that main block is probably the initial part of the structure. General Wedemeyer, yes, thank you for putting that in here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, comment says that he's always heard that it was named Friends Advice because General bought it on Friends Advice. That's possible. Yeah, I always talk about across the street from this house is the Joseph White House, and that property survey is named Wolf's Cow, which I think is awesome. I have no idea where that came from, but it is kind of what is cool about those kind of property survey names is that even though they're extremely old, they stay with us. And so, though a lot of old homeowners in the area tell me, like, even on their tax forms today, like in official tax records when they're filing their taxes, those property names still come up on their tax forms, which is just kind of neat that it's been passed down through the years. So again, Friends Advice, large, very cool structure with those linkages. Okay, so with that, I know that was kind of fast, but I wanted to see if there were any questions or comments or anything from there.
It was interesting, as always. Always enjoy your talks.
Wasn't Montevideo, Kipling's place, wasn't that
Yeah.
a loyalist property that got confiscated and then the Peters bought it?
That might be actually, Jim. That's a good point. I don't remember offhand. I'll have to ask Knight that, but yeah, I mean, timeline wise, well, so Montevideo, the home, is from the 1820s. So it's after the Revolutionary War, but the property itself, we there was likely some structure there before then. So that's completely possible.
Well,
Uh,
it was a big land grant. I think the
yeah,
owner wouldn't have signed the oath of fidelity. I think
yeah,
An- I think Annington was the same way.
interesting. Okay. I'll have to look at that. I don't know, but that sounds familiar when you say that. I feel like I've heard that before as well.
I read it somewhere, but I just looked through my notes and I can't find it.
Hmm. All right. I'll give it a look too. That's a good point. Um, the one place I didn't mention on here, which is cool, is there is a cemetery called Mother's Delight, um, which is out in Boyd's, and it's very much a lot of the Dawson family members were buried there, many of whom were Revolutionary War veterans, and it's hard to even describe where it's located. I mean, it's out in the middle of nowhere in kind of the woods. And I believe in the 1920s, all but the two or three of the stones were like most of the gravestones were moved to Monocacy Cemetery. We believe the bodies there were also moved, although who knows? But there are still at least two stones out there in the middle of the woods for Dawson family members, and I believe one of them is a Revolutionary War veteran, and it's an interesting place that it is just kind of like a weird forgotten tie back to this time period to the Revolutionary War that I wish got more attention, but at the same time it's on private property, and so the owners don't obviously love a lot of attention, but just kind of feels like veterans of this cause should be recognized in some way.
Well, most of the residents of Foosville area, which were in the Sugar Land 100, and then you
Yeah.
had the Sugar 100, and all them, they were all in militia units.
Hmm.
Some of them were activated for like 2 months or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
They never really saw any action, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think the experience here was just different than what it was during the Civil War, in that regard. But
Well, Marylanders had a habit of going off and getting themselves killed, so they did in New York.
yeah, it's true.
Well, thank you, Kenny, very much.
Anytime.
It's always fascinating, and your visuals always amaze me. I'm always curious as to the vast majority of those pictures that you showed us. Have you went out and taken them?
No, some of them are from me. Most of them are there was a couple of individuals in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s who just went out and cataloged like every single old building really across the county. And they got kind of dumped into this weird like share drive folder that Montgomery County, government maintains. I don't even know if
Mhm.
they know that it's open to anybody, but I found it years ago and it's like a treasure trove. And it's thousands of pictures that are unmarked. So you just have to spend like hours in there. But I've spent so much time now, and that's where I largely like pull a lot of those pictures from. It's like an amazing resource um,
Wow.
that the county maintains. I don't know if they know they have it, but it's really, really helpful to be able to see some of these structures, through the years.
Mhm. Well, I'm glad you're willing to parse through it and take a look at it because
I love it. Yeah.
it's fascinating. It really is. But thank you so much for presenting tonight, and I appreciate it, and we look forward to your future presentations for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.